I'm ready. I got 2 hours worth of material. So better get started now if we want to get. That's right. If we want to get out of here by 4, we better start now.
Always prepared. Well, maybe I should have quick break before lunch. That way we better. I could.
You just got to stay here longer, bro.
That's true. Good afternoon and welcome to seminar. Our today's speaker is Dr. Josh McGrath. He's originally from Smyrna, Delaware. He graduated his undergrad from Johns Hopkins University and earned his PhD from the University of Delaware. And then he did his postdoc at Virginia Tech. Before coming to UK, he was an associate professor and extension specialist at the University of Maryland. While there, he was heavily involved in the Chesapeake Bay water quality issues and policy development. Dr. McGrath joined the department in July of 2014 as an associate professor and soil management specialist. His research and extension activities focus on agricultural productivity and environmental quality as they relate to soil fertility, nutrient management, and water quality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McGrath.
Thanks. All right. So I'm not actually going to talk about navigating nutrients in a world of competing interests. I just used that title because that alliteration, it sounded pretty good. I've already lost one of my 2 microphones. We have redundancy now in case one doesn't work, I guess, because we've been having problems. But we might talk, we might cover a few things about this title as far as competing interests. I thought I'd start off, I felt like it was better to maybe be a little broader than just the policy talk I had originally proposed, to give folks in the department a better idea of some of the things that I might be working on here, and a little bit of my background. So most of this has already been covered with my introduction. Thank you very much. That's me when I was about 5 years old, first day of kindergarten, and I still look pretty much the same. Interesting fact, my bachelor's is a Bachelor of Arts from Johns Hopkins, not a Bachelor of Science. So it just proves that you can do whatever you want if you put your mind to it. I became a scientist of sorts at some point in my life. And my postdoc was really mostly interested in looking at satellite imagery of forests that had been reclaimed surface mines. So I spent about 2 years walking through strip mines. So I spent a solid 6 months walking through eastern Kentucky during my postdoc experiences. So my current interests and things that I'm working on, small scale variability and precision management, so precision ag. Do soil phosphorus critical levels vary in space and time, and if so, why? This is International Plant Nutrition Institute has funded. They funded a phosphorus fellowship, and Jimmy Bowen, some of you know, is the phosphorus fellow for that project, and working on delivering better nitrogen recommendations for cereal grain production, mostly corn, and also building a better manure applicator. I probably won't get to that, but it's included in the bonus track at the end of this presentation. So if you stay late, maybe we'll talk about it if you're really interested. And another interesting fun fact about me, I lived in this bus for almost a year in the backyard of a friend's house down in Virginia, in Catawba, Virginia, while I was a postdoc in Blacksburg. So it's a 1974 International bus. So who knows what it's up to now? It could be. So 4 R's of nutrient management. 4 R's are the industry standard. It's that they train mainly retailers in the fertilizer industry around of the right rate at the right time in the right place in a well-managed cropping system. Those are the 4 R's. A lot of folks get kind of confused because they're not thinking that all the 4 R's are actually, right. They're trying to think of things like rate, and then they get lost on the other 3. But right, and this is what often gets lost. So we train farmers and retailers for fertilizer management around these 4 R's, but what's the definition of right? There are multiple rights, and that right is really defined by the performance objective. So you could have objectives like optimized production, increased yield, minimized environmental impact, and I would say that often these performance objectives that are indicated around the outside ring of that figure that IPNI puts out can be in competition. And I think it's important to understand that agronomically small nutrient losses of nitrogen and phosphorus, primarily what we're talking about here, can be environmentally significant. And there are real trade-offs for farmers in managing for environmental protection. And I would argue that, and recently in several articles that have appeared in the Washington Post in the past week and the New York Times, that you're going to have significant economic loss if you try to manage environmental losses in agriculture. And oftentimes, and I get very frustrated that there's criticism of our agricultural system. They go, well, what we're promoting is best for the farmer, because if they keep the nitrogen they paid for in their fields, then you know, they're going to be more profitable. They paid for that nitrogen, so keeping it in the field is the best thing for them from a profitability standpoint. And this simply isn't true. The way the system is constructed, that ultimately you can be more profitable with a very leaky system. And that is because of the scale of these losses agronomically versus environmentally. We'll get into that later. So the most profitable system will likely have an environmental impact. Specifically under current agricultural system, and by system I mean large global agricultural economy that's highly specialized, where we grow grain, corn in the Midwest United States, and then animals, meat production in other areas very intensively. So a little bit about nitrogen and phosphorus, some fundamentals of phosphorus management. Phosphorus isn't like nitrogen. That shouldn't be a surprise. Less than 15% of applied phosphorus is probably available in the first year. Some estimated at around 5 to 10%. Reductions in rate, so talking about the 4 R's, may not improve efficiency. So reductions in rate this year might not improve phosphorus use efficiency. And increasing phosphorus use efficiency, which is the percent of the applied phosphorus that gets in the harvested portion of the grain, is what I'm using to talk about efficiency right now. Do not decrease the risk of phosphorus loss to surface water. Placement, how you place the phosphorus can control risk and direct loss. Timing can control loss, but for different reasons than nitrogen. So I would say that there's a dubious relationship between phosphorus use efficiency and P loss. And so this is another thing that often we hear in the media or when talking to either farmers say it all the time, well, I'm very efficient with my P. Just kind of casually say that. Or people in environmental groups or policymakers, regulators may say, well, we need to increase phosphorus use efficiency. It's highly likely that increases in phosphorus use efficiency, fertilizer phosphorus use efficiency, in the short term won't help us meet our water quality goals. Phosphorus requires a long-term focus on balance issues to avoid this legacy phosphorus issue I'll talk about, and a short-term focus on field management to minimize loss. So P balances, P use efficiency, unlike N, has little real meaning, and that's because of this temporal component that phosphorus use efficiency doesn't capture. So if I apply 100 pounds of P2O5 per acre, more than likely, 85 to 90 pounds of that's going to be tied up in the soil, by the soil. And the remainder might go into the crop or it might not. And so unlike nitrogen, where if it doesn't go in the crop, it's lost, there's a large amount that is retained by the soil because the soil has a high capacity for phosphorus. So looking at P budgets or balances seems to make the most sense over the long term to assess these legacy effects. And what are those legacy effects? We have these systemic balance issues where animal industry occurs. For example, poultry, the majority of phosphorus in grain that they're fed, they can't digest. They pass through them, phytate P. Now, we've manipulated diets, including phytase and enzymes, so that they can digest that P, but we still have to feed a large portion of the phosphorus they need for metabolism and growth, et cetera. And so a lot of the supplemented phosphorus and the phytate in the grain is excreted by the bird and stays right there on the farm. So, for example, in the Delmarva Peninsula, where I did a lot of work, 40 to 60% of the grain fed to the poultry grown there is imported from the Midwest. And so you're just bringing a lot of P in that stays on site. And so it just becomes, a simple checkbook issue. And we can do 2 types of budgets for watersheds or regions, typically. Phosphorus inputs versus removal and harvest, or phosphorus inputs versus recommendations. And phosphorus recommendations, fertilizer recommendations, are based on a soil test value. So what does your soil test say you need versus what's being harvested? Those are 2 very different things. So this was some work that we did in Delaware a while back, looking at phosphorus balances. And I think it's kind of instructive to take a look at this. So this phosphorus management balance is the phosphorus applied on average across the entire state of Delaware. It's pretty easy to do this for a state like Delaware. You grow corn, wheat, and beans. There's 457,000 acres of cropland, and the only animal industry that's meaningful is poultry. So it's very simple to do it there. It's a little more difficult somewhere like Kentucky. So on average, this is surplus in pounds per acre of surplus per year. We started in 1996. This ran through 2005. In 1998, water quality laws were implemented that were mandatory for NMP-based planting in the state of Delaware. And so compared to the soil test value, and again, the data, you can argue about how good the data is, but I think the trends are pretty clear. But manure and fertilizer are your big sources, and this is how much surplus phosphorus from manure and fertilizer are added relative to what the soil test would recommend across the whole state using average soil test values. And you see that we started with a very significant surplus, over 20 pounds of P2O5 per acre per year, and ended with a very significant surplus of about 12 pounds of P2O5 per acre per year. That's a really high, from an environmental perspective, high surplus that you're adding above what the crop requires. But if we look at phosphorus in and out versus harvest, we see that over that same time period, basically we came into balance. So what accounted for that change? Reduced fertilizer sales. Fertilizer sales went down by 60%. When I was just starting out in grad school right here, the common thought was I still needed started phosphorus fertilizer on my planter even if I was applying 6 tons of poultry litter per year. I still needed that fertilizer kick. So basically everyone dropped all that starter out. The manure transport program, so we shipped phosphorus around to other farms. We paid for that or paid to move it out of the state. And we decreased the actual amount of phosphorus in the poultry litter. We brought that down by about 47% by better dietary strategies. You see that just started to tail back up at the end of this period. We've continued to track. And so basically the technology came to a standstill. We stopped adding starter. We were doing a little bit better nutrient management planning. We're shipping all the litter that we can ship at this point economically. There's no more dietary changes, and the number of chickens is increasing. So now we're getting back to this environmental surplus, this surplus beyond what the crop was removing. And that's a problem. And that's that systemic issue that we're talking about, is that crop removal versus inputs. And that surplus is simply P that's being imported into the watershed and feed. Right. So Chad's question, for those in Princeton, if there is anyone in Princeton, there might not be, was, for the dumb agronomist, where does that blue line need to go to make water quality better? Yes, so we have this surplus that's going to persist in the orange line. We have phosphorus in manure that's going to be applied to fields with high soil test P. But we need to be removing more than we're putting in to get those soils down to concentrations that are environmentally sustainable or aren't as leaky. So it wasn't uncommon for me to see soil test phosphorus on the Delmarva Peninsula around 1,000 milligrams per kilogram malic-free extractable P. Our critical level is probably around 25. In other words, the point above which fertilizer is not doing as much good, around 25 to 30 milligrams per kilogram of malic-free P, right? So orders of magnitude greater soil tests in these regions with intensive animal production. So we want to pull this down and see it stay down, and that's a very long-term process, as we see with this next slide. Thank you for the lead-in, Jack. So this was some work that we did, long-term studies still going forward in Maryland at 3 different sites, one with poultry litter, one with dairy manure, and one with beef manure, and this is averaged across all the sites. This is malic-free soil test P on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis, and the bottom blue line had no phosphorus added over the entire time it was cropped. The rotations were slightly different at the different sites. It was a split plot design with a grain crop rotation and a forage rotation with maximum biomass removal to try and draw down that soil test P. And we see, so on average, the 3 sites started up around 100 milligrams per kilogram, not what we would consider environmentally sensitive. Regulations in Maryland don't kick in until 150. Critical level below which we need fertilizer, again, is down here around 30. And so somewhere in between needing fertilizer and you have to do a phosphorus index for nutrient management due to regulatory concerns. And we see that without any P application, continuing cropping, we see very slow drop in soil test P. We did see yields start to decline after about 10 to 12 years in those cropping systems. You see, once we added basically 1x, 2x, 3x, and 4x rates of manure over this time period from 1994 through 1997, you see this rapid buildup to 4 different levels of soil test P. You see a rapid decrease over time. We stopped applying phosphorus. First 4 years we applied it, then we stopped. You see this drop off. That's basically absorption by the iron and aluminum minerals in the soil, so it's no longer extractable by Mehlich-3, which of course is not total phosphorus, it's just kind of the agronomic test. And then we see a very slow decline over time. At the highest rate, and actually we've done some more advanced analysis of these soils, and what we see is these 2 soils fall out in a group, and these 2 soils fall out in a group relative to their P sorption capacity. So we actually changed the chemistries in these soils by the addition of the organic phosphorus and organic material to those soils. But the main story here is after we bring up to moderate, I mean, so remember I said I saw soils that were 1,000, this only got up to around 400. Just getting up to 400, that's not a big deal. If a farmer came into me with a soil test and a nutrient management plan, I'd go, oh, you're not who we're worried about. But it's going to take about 50 years for that to get back down below that starting point at least. So it takes a very long time to draw down soil test P. It's not really, this is a political issue, and political time scales, 50 years, might as well tell them it's 1,000,000 years, right? So, but hydrology is also important. This shows hydrology versus phosphorus source being in the soil for runoff. This is some work of Tony Buda up at the ARS in State College, Pennsylvania. And basically they have 3 fields with 3 different phosphorus loss, 8 kilograms per hectare per year, that's pretty bad. 1 kilogram per hectare per year, and less than 1 kilogram per hectare per year, okay? So this isn't great, but that's really bad. And what we see is this came from a field with relatively low soil test P, 78 milligrams per kilogram, and these 2 were around 150 and 175. But they had much less phosphorus loss. So why was that? Runoff volume for those 3 fields, you have a much greater amount of water leaving this field. So this was down at the bottom of the field was a strip crop system near the stream, seasonally saturated, wet soils, precipitation often exceeded infiltration, and so you had a lot more water moving off, and with it, it was carrying phosphorus. This was up the hill, and so you had a lot more infiltration. Interestingly enough, manure was being applied to these fields, no manure was being applied down here with the highest phosphorus loss. So also management and soil tests, were completely overwhelmed just by the fact you had more water leaving that lower position in the field. So hydrology, even in the absence of manure, elevated by the soil source. And so if we just strictly said, okay, farmer, if your soil test is over where you need it, 30, 100, whatever, you can't apply manure. And this farmer's a dairy farmer. He would have gone down here, and if it was strictly a soil test-based regulation, applied his manure down here and greatly exacerbated this problem, right? So we have to be careful of looking at these as single issues. But hydrology is not the only issue. This is some work also from Maryland. 1 field, 4 tillage treatments, 3 replicates, same manure rate across the field, same soil test phosphorus across the field, same hydrology and slope, and very different results. This is total phosphorus load in pounds per acre, no-till, turbo-till, strip-till, and conventional tillage. Now, I know this is heresy in Kentucky, but with apologies, no-till caused significantly more phosphorus loss. So what is this? It's incidental transfer. It's direct dissolution of phosphorus from the poultry litter that was applied and left on the surface unprotected. The greater the contact between the manure and the soil, the less phosphorus loading from that field, because erosion wasn't our issue. Particulate-bound phosphorus was not the issue. On a different field where particulate-bound phosphorus is your issue, obviously we wouldn't recommend tillage. So we've got to remember that best management practices are not one size fits all. They are spatially variable in their efficacy. So, the point of this is management plays a big role. But sometimes infield management doesn't work either. This is some work of Pete Kleiman's. This is concentration dissolved P, milligrams per liter in surface runoff. across time, 2003. And basically they spread manure here, and we see that signal in the surface runoff concentration, high P loss, or high P concentration in that runoff. And then it drops down to background after a little while. A couple rainfall events incorporate that manure into the soil and incorporate that phosphorus, get it in contact with the iron and aluminum minerals, and we see the concentration drop off greatly. But if we look in the ditch that runs along the edge of that field, the red dots, we don't even see a signal from the application. Those red dots represent the concentration in the ditch running beside the field. Okay, so they were measuring runoff over the surface of the field, and they were measuring concentration at the same time in the ditch that was draining the field. And so, you know, management as far as tillage or anything else really wouldn't have helped here, because this was a legacy P issue. This field had very high soil test P, over 500 milligrams per kilogram, and the phosphorus was just slowly leaking into that ditch. Subsurface flow, shallow subsurface flow pathways made up about 90% of the water moving through the ditch. So where was the water coming from? It wasn't running across the surface. It was infiltrating and then traveling through shallow pathways and ending up in that ditch. So to sum it up, we need to manage soil P, certainly, and look at phosphorus use efficiency and applying to meet crop removal and some things like that to achieve long-term goals, so we don't get into the situation with very high soil P. We need to use BMPs in the near term to meet these near-term goals, but you know, manage the applied source to minimize exposure and maximize crop availability. Phosphorus transport and limiting it is all about interrupting transport pathways. So reducing runoff is the name of the game when it comes to phosphorus. How can you limit runoff, increase infiltration, and slow the water down leaving the field? But often we have competing transport pathways as far as that goes. You know, you can have tillage and maybe you're decreasing infiltration, increasing runoff. Buffer strips were widely advocated as a solution to the phosphorus problems in Chesapeake Bay, but there's been some research that shows edge of field buffer strips in some situations can actually increase P loading because of preferential flow pathways through those buffer strips and increase velocity. So basically, spatial and temporal variability in BMP efficacy require site specificity. So we need to use some advanced modeling and some things like that to get better at phosphorus management. But ultimately, all of these BMPs are only temporary delays to a long-term complex systemic issue. We're just kicking the can down the road. And the past focus has been solely on these issues like the Delmarva, swine production in Iowa, areas where we have really intensive animal agriculture with these huge nutrient imbalances. And so we focus all our efforts on these animal areas. But recent issues in Lake Erie watershed and Western Lake Erie bring to light, you know, some new concerns. Okay, so that's Western Lake Erie. That's the New York Times just a week or two ago, I think. And the watershed is dominated by low soil phosphorus, fertilizer instead of manure, and no-till. And in fact, most of the finger being pointed is being pointed at no-till, but for different reasons than the no-till problem that I identified earlier. There's not really a manure issue going on here. IPNI does every 5 years a big survey of soil test results, and they reported that 48% of Ohio soil samples in 2015 were below the critical level. That's about like Kentucky. The majority of farmers in Kentucky need some phosphorus fertilizer. As a matter of fact, about half of farmers in Kentucky or Ohio are probably losing yield because they're not using phosphorus fertilizer. Ohio median soil test P has fallen each year that they've done the soil test. So they're going down. They're drawing down with higher yields and better management. They're drawing down their soil resource phosphorus. They're mining that phosphorus. I talk to people in the fertilizer industry all the time, and the phosphorus fertilizer industry is a mature industry. Sales haven't changed in the United States very much in decades. Basically, the people that apply fertilizer always apply fertilizer whether they need it or not, and the people who need fertilizer never apply it or apply too little. And that's just the way it is, and we can't change their mind, right? And so they don't see the fertilizer industry in the United States changing at all. And they're actually not terribly worried about environmental rules and all this sort of stuff with fertilizer because, you know, they hope that maybe increased education will, you know, sell some more fertilizer to those people who aren't applying that should. But this is very concerning. If we have these significant problems in Western Lake Erie, and these are actually the conditions on the ground, I'm not sure we have any answers. I mean, we kind of know what the issues are. We say, okay, it's fall application of MAP and DAP. in no-till situations. So a very soluble fertilizer source on the surface. A lot of tile drainage has increased in this time period as the lake has gotten worse. And so you're getting soluble phosphorus moving through macropores to tile drains that short-circuit the system and move it right to Lake Erie, right? The Maumee watershed and those sorts of places. That sounds simple enough. You say, well, get it off of the surface and break up those macropores a little bit. But we still have to remember that a lot of this significant loading is coming from fields with soil tests in the single digits. And so I'm not sure that that simplistic answer is actually the solution. I'm not really sure where the tipping point of the trade-off is, because Lake Erie used to be really terrible in the 60s and 70s. There's probably only a few people here that remember Johnny Carson. I don't, but I've looked him up on YouTube. And he said at one time that Lake Erie is where good fish go to die, right? And what did they do to make the lake better? They started no-tilling. Okay, so the lake was really terrible. They stopped tillage, and you know that phosphorus level in the lake started dropping because they were decreasing sediment loading. And it dropped, and it dropped, and it dropped, and it dropped, and the lake was in really good shape. And then it did this and started going back up. And that was as the no-till started to take effect, we started to get stratification. And those no-till fields, all the phosphorus is staying in the top inch of the soil. And they're starting to build big macropores that can quickly move phosphorus because the inside of that channel of that macropore gets saturated with phosphorus, and so the soil won't retain the phosphorus, and it can move right to the tile drain and out of the system. So I think these systems are complex, and we don't have good answers. I think that part of the answer might reside in looking at precision management. So that's where a lot of my efforts recently have been focused, because the manure issue is, you know, it is what it is. It's going to be there for 100 years. We can change the animal agriculture industry, but even then those soils are going to stay elevated for 100 years. And we just, you know, unless we're going to dig all that soil up and take it somewhere else as fertilizer, that's going to stay put. But these fertilizer-based issues in places like Lake Erie are going to be problematic. So what do we need for variable rate to do precision ag? 70% of dealers report that they offer VR, single or multi-nutrient fertilizer application. So, you know, typically we figure that about 70% of phosphorus applied is applied variable rate on corn in the United States. But what's the basis for that? We need a high resolution characterization of spatial variable nutrient need. So in other words, a map that shows us where the phosphorus is and where the phosphorus isn't, and a prescription based on that map, right? So what's the spatial distribution of nutrient need? Interpretation of soil test results with matching precision. So you get a soil test result that says your soil phosphorus concentration is 45 milligrams per kilogram, and we tell you don't need phosphorus. And you get one that says 10 milligrams per kilogram, and we tell you do need phosphorus. But we need that interpretation to have precision matching what we're trying to do in the field. We need recommendations that are developed for VR application, and I'll get into that in a minute, but basically, you know, spatially variable recommendation and equipment that can handle that. So we can vary P at a pretty fine resolution. I tell the engineers all the time, you know, they made this hammer, but they didn't give us a nail, and so we're just going around hitting this stuff with it, okay? Like the sprayers, the fertilizer applicators, they can vary phosphorus rate. Well, we have no mechanism to make a sound recommendation. So what they do is they just use the existing recommendations that were built up around an average approach to the whole field, and we just retrofit those, and it's not a good approach. So we can't precisely map P at the resolution required, and we don't develop recommendations at that resolution. So how do they map? I mean, people are making recommendations. 70% of the dealers are making recommendations. But what they do is they sample on a grid, typically 2.5 acres, maybe 1 acre if they're really progressive. 1 acre grid. It's really expensive, and most farmers tell you they can't do it. So they go and take a sample every acre, and then they interpolate, right? So there's this statistical method to estimate what the value is between two known points. And so this unknown point, the value is estimated. It's kind of a weighted average of the points around it are used to interpolate that value in the middle that's unknown. This is some data from a friend of mine at Penn State, John Spargo. They went out and they sampled a field at a 1/4 acre. They used just the 1 acre samples. So this is the map with the 1 acre samples. This is the map with the 1/4 acre samples. And this work has been published widely, and yet I think probably the best paper on it is if you look, there's a paper that was in the Agronomy Journal by Lausen back in 2005 that shows this very clearly. when retailers hear me give a talk where I talk about this and they question it, I always just send them that paper. They sampled at a 1/4 acre, same thing. It tends to be the magic number. And then they make it more coarse by dropping points out. And then they know what the value is here, and they look at the interpolated value. And always the field average of the 1 acre samples is closer to the true value than the interpolated value. In other words, if they had just done a 1 acre grid, put all the samples in a bucket, mixed it up really good, and sent one sample to the lab, they were better off. Because soil properties are stochastic. They are random such that they can be predicted accurately. So on average, they vary quite a bit in small distances. But on average, we can predict what they do. We're not trying to predict on average. We're not trying to be accurate. We're trying to be precise. Okay? And so we're better off to have more samples, all the 1 acre samples in one bucket than just the nearest ones being used to predict what that value is. So all of these interpolated maps are basically wrong. Unless the field has no variation, it's a very, flat field, in which case you don't need to be doing variable rate application anyway. So we were better, the one advantage of precision ag is the number of samples people are collecting. They weren't collecting enough samples before. So, this is what I'm talking about, accuracy versus precision. This is high precision, but you're missing the target. This is the way our soil tests were built. Our soil test recommendations over time are very accurate. Lots of replicated trials over time, 4 rates replicated, and on average, you're right. I loved Dr. Vendroth when he was advertising his statistics class last year. He had a cartoon hanging up in the hallway that I really liked. How many people saw it? The two, what was it? The statistician and the 2 agronomists, and they're deer hunting together, and the agronomist on the left shot and missed the deer a foot to the right, and the agronomist on the right shot and missed the deer to the right a foot, and the statistician in the middle goes, got him. That's the way our soil tests operate, is that for the whole field, got it. But at every point in the field, we're wrong. And every year, we're wrong, because there's also temporal variability. And so the question is, can we overcome that? Some people will tell you, well, it's better than what we were doing before. I'm not sure that it is. And I'm not sure we know how to test whether it is or not. So we got to talk about soil test interpretation, correlation, and calibration, how we get at the recommendation systems. I'm not going to get too lost in the weeds on this. I imagine most people don't care. But this is what we do to figure out how much fertilizer to apply based on soil test. And when we look, calibration is the amount of nutrient applied versus that soil test value, and correlation is the relative yield versus a soil test value. And this is what we're worried about right now, correlation. So what soil test value do I need to start fertilizing as I go down the scale? So we collect a bunch of data that looks like this, except for not this good, because this is fake data. I always say don't let real data get in the way of a good story. It's an extension thing. But so, we basically plot relative yield in a field versus soil test, or across many fields against soil test concentration, right? But where do we pick that change point? Because it really is just a cloud of data. All these fields are different, and every year it's different. So how do we pick that point? We have statistical methods to do it. But the question is, these methods were all designed, again, to be accurate, not to be precise. So do we need a different method? Do we need to throw this out completely if we're going to come up with a correlation for a precision ag approach? And that's what they've done with nitrogen management. With nitrogen management, they sense each individual plant using active sensors or tools like that, and they're looking at that plant response to the nutrient availability. And plants lie. As Dr. Grove points out, you can't trust a plant. So, what addition to soil P concentration, what if, addition to soil P concentration varying, the critical level varies, spatially and temporally, right? So right now, we're only talking about the soil test is varying as you travel across the field. But what if that point where you need to add fertilizer, phosphorus to the field changes? What if at this point, 30 ppm is good enough, and over here, I need 60 pounds of phosphate, and yet the soil test is 30 ppm as well? So now we've got two things moving in different directions. We've got the availability and the plant response moving in different directions. But we've done things the same way forever. 5 phosphorus rates, randomized, 5 blocks at 4 locations, for 3 years. And then we give a recommendation. We just keep doing the same thing over and over and over. and over again. I have trials out right now that are set up this way. And we're going to run proc mixed on them. Now, I'm pretty advanced. I run proc mixed. I imagine Dr. Grove's still on proc GLM, right? Oh, you're more advanced than me. See, you can teach an old dog new tricks. So, I mean, you know, we look at ANOVA, we look at mean separation, and we walk away from it. I would argue that we need new research design and analysis methods, that we need new research tools, not just statistical, but equipment. And some of these tools won't have any application to the farmers. I keep talking to the ag engineers, and they have no interest in building a plot combine for a researcher. There's not enough market. And most of the researchers wouldn't buy it anyway. It'd be like me and one other person that ordered it by accident. And so, you know, they're not interested in making that new combine, but we cannot measure yield precisely. You can't trust a combine number. If you're looking at a farmer's combine, let's say an 8-row combine, just an 8-row combine, if you want to have an accurate estimate of yield, you've got to have at least a 400-foot plot length with an 8-row combine. With a yield monitor equipped 2-row combine like we're using, which might be the only one like that in the United States according to the plot combine dealer, and it was built for Dick Barnheisel by Scott Shear, and it's falling apart. You know, maybe we can do it in a 30 or 40-foot plot. We can get it, but 30 or 40 feet, that's not very precise. When it's been established that plants are varying, you know, almost by plant in the field. That's the amount of variation in the field that we can manage at if we had the capability to measure. So historically, soil testing is focused on accuracy and not precision. And the stochastic nature of soil properties, you know, the precision is amplified when managing at a higher spatial resolution. So we were all right when we were using our recommendations across the whole field, but all of a sudden we start amplifying all of the imprecision in our experimental methods to develop that recommendation. We're amplifying them when we start trying to apply them at a very small spatial resolution. So perhaps we should sacrifice some accuracy for greater spatial precision. We need to examine soil test interpretation and recommendations in the context of site-specific management. We need to look at probability of response, quantity versus intensity, temporal resolution. On-the-go variable rate nitrogen sensors might provide an example. I'm not saying they do, but if we could maybe translate that to P&K, because they do try to address small-scale variability and make recommendations based on yield and potential responsiveness. So we're trying to do some of this research. We're trying to come up with new ways to do it, but I don't know that we have the answer. And as a matter of fact, it might be an utter failure. But we're working with a bunch of other folks doing some really small-scale plot work across whole fields. So that our plots are basically 10 foot by 10 foot. We ended up making them actually 30 foot by 10 foot. And then we put them randomly all over an entire field. But we don't have a way that really gives us precise yield measurements at that small scale across these distances. You know, if you ask an engineer, we say, we asked them when we started this project, at what resolution can we measure yield? And they said 5 feet. So then we set up the plots and we did it. And I said, something's not making sense here. And they said, well, yeah, you can measure yield at 5 feet, but you can't precisely measure yield at 5 feet. So you get what you ask for. So real quickly, I'm going to buzz through nitrogen fast. But nitrogen requirement to achieve maximum yield for cereal grains is determined by nitrogen responsiveness, availability, and potential yield. All 3 factors vary spatially and temporally, and all 3 factors are independent of each other and independent of time. That's what makes up nitrogen requirement for a corn plant. It's complex. And then you lay over top of that soil type, climate, previous management, that those vary in space and time, and they influence yield potential, nitrogen availability, and nitrogen responsiveness independently, and it gets really complex being able to accurately predict nitrogen requirement, or at least precisely predict year to year. And so I would argue that nitrogen surpluses exist due to our recommendations. So with phosphorus, it's the systemic issue of the way animal agriculture is set up. And that's why we have phosphorus surpluses. But even a farmer who is following university recommendations is applying more nitrogen. I'm dropping one of my mics. Is applying more nitrogen than that crop is going to take up. We're applying excess to account for loss or some sort of attenuation in the system with nitrogen. So the recommendations account for surpluses. You know, and then we also are constantly asking ourselves, why does this happen? Here's, you know, a nitrogen response trial, nitrogen on the horizontal, bushels per acre on the vertical, and we've got this one site, 205 bushels per acre with no nitrogen applied. 40% of the time, if you go across all nitrogen research studies published in the literature, the check yields as well as the optimum nitrogen rate. 40% of the time, we don't need nitrogen. I wouldn't say that at a farmer meeting, but I mean, in research, we see this happen. The question is why. I can tell you what it was. This data is from 2008. The weekend before Memorial Day that year, it went up to over 100 degrees for 3 days. That's extremely unusual weather. It was extremely wet that spring. And 18 years prior, that field had had some swine manure applied. So for 18 years, some organic N had been hanging out. Early in May, we got really warm soil temperatures early with a lot of moisture, and we got a flush of mineralization. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. The next year and the year before, that didn't exist at that same field trial. It was a multi-year trial. So here's nitrogen surpluses, and they're exact opposite trend of what we saw for phosphorus. Before, the in and out fell down below. We were in balance, and the management wasn't in balance. Now, here's the management for nitrogen over that time period, pounds per acre of nitrogen per year. But I would say that we use total N for manure, and farmers are allowed to apply manure based on plant available N. And the plant available N, we didn't have a way to take that out of the data set we had. But if we did, this would probably drop down to 0. We did some estimations, and we decided not to do all the hand waving. But our best guess, professional judgment here, is that farmers by 2006 were applying exactly what Delaware recommended, Delaware official recommendations. And over the term, it continued that way. They were following our recommendations. And I think that's true. And I would say that actually a lot of farmers were applying below recommendation that were irrigating as irrigation improved. But if we look at climatic variations, what we see with the surplus. So even though they're following recommendation, in this year they applied, almost what the university recommended, but it was dry. And so a lot of nitrogen stayed in the field and didn't go out in the grain. And so what the state did as far as policy guidance from this, they looked at this and they just started paying for irrigation. Maryland was paying for cover crops. Maryland has 75% of their acres covered with cover crops, right? And they pay a lot of money for those cover crops. But I would argue that cover crops don't address this surplus issue because they're just cycling the nitrogen in the system. We still need them, but the irrigation is going to make that green line fall right on that blue line, ostensibly. Again, accuracy versus precision, though, it's the lack of precision in our recommendations that are causing a problem. This is some data I adapted from Frank Cole, a proud alum of Dr. Grove's program here at the University of Kentucky. And we look at a nitrogen response curve in red, and that's return to nitrogen, dollars per acre. And this is nitrate in the top meter at each of those nitrogen rates, kind of modeled out. The percentages are the percentage of applied fertilizer that was left at the end of the season in the top meter. And we see that this point can shift spatially and temporally. So in one spot in the field, this isn't the optimum nitrogen rate, and another it is, and year to year it changes dramatically. And so what effect does that lack of precision have? Well, this is the economic optimum yield at 173 bushels per acre with a nitrogen rate of 205 pounds per acre. This was pre-season applied urea, okay? It wasn't split applied. It wasn't very efficient. They were using about 2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of yield. So way over our state recommendations. Just happened to be this stud. But the match yield was 1 bushel higher, but with 25 more pounds of nitrogen to get there. Now this is model data. They didn't have these finer treatments. So we modeled out the response curve. But just to give you an idea of how those little adjustments left or right from the optimum, which the farmer doesn't even know what optimum is. They're just following the recommendations their crop advisor or the state gives them. Well, let's assume for a second they did know what the right rate was. That little change, that little shift would account for 17 additional pounds of nitrate in the top meter. That's environmentally significant post-harvest. That is likely going to leach from these sandy soils. That's amazing. That little shift, 1 bushel, 25 pounds of nitrogen. I doubt anyone's applying within 50 pounds of the right rate in their field. And this is why we have a lot of nitrogen in the Mississippi River. Not because farmers are grossly over-applying because they're thumbing their nose at the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico, because our recommendation systems stink. They have no precision. Over the long term, over many years, they're accurate. They stink in every field every year. And so if we take those response curves and we put them out over different years, the same response function for nitrate, we see that when we have a drought year, all the nitrogen you apply goes to the Mississippi River, the Chesapeake Bay. So we look at improving nitrogen recommendations. The one system I've spent a lot of time with is sensor-based nitrogen, using something like the Green Seeker. They're all rain-fed. Those are rain-fed yield response curves. This is a little unfair, but it's kind of for point of example. We didn't have nitrate data on these other 3 examples, so I'm using the nitrate model from Frank's data and applying it to 2 other studies I had yield data for. Then you kind of know what rate you need, right? You can, so our recommendation system is based on yield. It's pretty good. It's a yield-based system. It's pretty good. And if you put irrigation in the equation, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to make that, 250 to 300 bushel. And most of those folks are going to be running about 6 to 8 tenths of pound of nitrogen per bushel of corn, whereas our recommendations are 1 pound per bushel of corn for drying. So the guys irrigating know they, through adaptively managing their nitrogen, have figured out that they can wind down their rates a little bit. But, we need increased precision, and the sensors, I don't have time to get into all of it. I threw a bunch of stuff in here, but what I want to get to is you're sensing this crop. But the sensors measure red and near infrareds and different things. The sensor doesn't matter. It's the algorithm that matters. And we see, so this is some data from Virginia Tech, 21% less nitrogen, the same yield. We see a little bump, but it's not statistically significant. About 3 bushels more grain in corn, about 7 bushels more in wheat. Not statistically significant, but we're going to come back to that. It's consistent. It's just lost in the noise. It never comes up statistically that the means separate. So, it predicts yield with nitrogen and yield if I don't fertilize is what that sensor's doing. On the go, every second as I drive across the field, applying fertilizer when the corn's this tall. Every second, it's changing the rate. And every second it's doing that by looking at the difference between if it adds fertilizer and it doesn't, using basically a modeled yield response, an empirical model. And this is the data that fed that model. It's pretty good. That's actually fairly decent yield prediction. And so you're varying that nitrogen as a function of nitrogen requirement, which remember is based on yield potential and responsiveness. How many bushels do I get for a pound of nitrogen? And how many bushels I get for a pound of nitrogen changes across, this is a little plant and this is a big plant. Really healthy plants, it's saying I'm going to get a lot more yield if I add some nitrogen than really bad plants in bad areas of the field. You can't beat good dirt is what this tells me. But we say, okay, so in the really good dirt, it's going up to unrealistic yield estimates, so I need to cut it off and bring it back down. So I'm saving nitrogen here. This is nitrogen rate, NDVI, so really good plants, less nitrogen. Really bad plants, less nitrogen. Average plants are getting more than what we typically recommend. And that's what the farmer, and this actually is a real world example, this is what the farmer would have applied to all those plants. And this is what the sensor predicts. And this is the equation it uses. Yield with nitrogen minus yield without nitrogen times the concentration of nitrogen in the grain divided by the fertilizer efficiency plus 100 kilograms per hectare minus whatever you put down pre-plant. There'll be a test later. But I would say we can go further. If we can get some modelers involved, we should be able to model nitrogen use efficiency based on soil characteristics, looking at nitrate and climate, and come up with very spatially precise maps of soil nitrate. And we should be able to predict maximum yield in the field, because the way we turn this back down is by just the farmer entering what he thinks the best 20% of the field does. We need to be able to set limits, because the farmer has to put a lot of inputs in this when he hops into the sprayer. So to be honest, even though we know this works, we're convinced this works, no one's doing it. Handful of people in the Chesapeake Bay, because people in Delaware, we're good at things like this. But no, I mean, they're under different pressures and the government pays them to do stuff. So, but we can make better equipment and we can provide guidance on limits. We need to get, the technology was developed in the late 90s and then it never advanced further. We just stopped there. And I would say that we need to work on that. I would also, as a side note, say we need to suspend disbelief and personal bias. I always found it funny that the environmental folks in Maryland want to set a hard cap that if you were using Green Seeker, you could use it up to the point the state recommendations kicked in at. So up to that line, the farmer would have applied the whole field. So the environmentalists didn't trust the algorithm up here. But the farmers always wanted to set the minimum allowable rate at what they were going to apply to the whole field because they didn't trust the algorithm here, right? This was fake news for the farmers, and this was fake news for the environmental folks. It just depends on who you are, what fake news is, right? So variable rate phosphorus is commonplace, but we do not have appropriate recommendation systems. Passive sensors, UAVs, satellites, Stone and these guys, they invented the active sensors. They looked at that stuff in the early 90s. It didn't work. And yet everyone that calls me wants to talk about using drones, remote-controlled airplanes, and fixed-wing Cessna aircraft to sense crops. In 1990, they proved it didn't work. It's not precise enough. The current active sensor market space, we have one technology with a decent amount of independent agronomic validation, lots, hundreds of papers published about it. Works great. The company that bought it provides no customer support and does not promote the technology. Then we have a technology with a crappy algorithm that was developed in Nebraska, and that's the only algorithm that's in it. There's not site-specific algorithms, but the company is a great company that promotes the product and provides tremendous support to the farmer. So that's what the market space is. We have to be cautious about these, bulk statements, 20% nitrogen reduction. This is just 1 year in 2010. The average was 25%, but each individual farmer had very different results. Again, precision in how we talk about these things. And then I would say, this is one on-farm nitrogen trial here in Kentucky, and I thought this was a really good example. This is what happens. So there was no statistical difference between these three nitrogen rates in yield. So if we're talking to the farmer, there's no statistical difference between this rate, and this rate. But why does the farmer apply this rate? There's actually a real economic reason. Uncertainty. The invisible hand of the market forces him to apply this rate. Look at how the yield levels group right there at the highest nitrogen rate. Yeah, this is the exact same yield, but look at the low outliers. We need to talk about variability, not just the average return on investment, because that's what precision ag is about. We need to talk about precision. And we need to understand that farmers are applying this rate because economically is the smartest decision. That excess nitrogen year in and year out pays for itself because they're not losing in those spots in the field where the soil couldn't supply the nitrogen. This crop down here was dependent on the undependable. John said you can't trust plants, you can't trust bugs. And the soil bugs had to supply some of the nitrogen down here, and we can't trust bugs. So I think, adjusting rate is one way forward, but I really think that we need to develop a new mousetrap. We need to understand why nitrogen surpluses exist. We need to get outside our boxes. We need to look at improved recommendation systems. We need to look at data management, interpretation, working with modelers, working across disciplines. Maybe a new fertilizer that's developed to release matching the uptake curve. We need engineers, modelers, soil scientists, agronomists to collaborate across spatial, temporal, and this is the most important, philosophical scale. It's hard for a soil scientist to talk to a modeler, and it's hard for a modeler to talk to a soil scientist, but we've got to figure out how to cross that gap. Final thought, we need new research tools. The small-scale plant-to-plant variability matter. We had a conversation at coffee last week. Do we manage the population? We hope that it'll compensate for those individual flaws. We don't know because we can't measure response at that scale. We can argue about it at coffee every Friday, Dr. Ailey, but we're not going to know until we can measure it. I mean, consider a 40-foot nitrogen response trial. Harvested by plot combine, so we're weighing the total weight. We're measuring the length of that plot. If we're off by 6 inches in the measurement of that plot, that's 4 bushel per acre difference for that plot. Remember earlier I said there's always a 3 bushel benefit to the green seeker? But it's in the background noise. But how do we know that's background noise if we can't even, because we measured one plant was missing. A deer ate one plant. 6 inches is one plant missing in a 40-foot plot in each row. We can't measure. So that noise that we've had in our research for the past 75 years has propagated itself through to our recommendations to make them accurate, but really imprecise. And we've got to figure out a way around this. So I just delivered on my promise, a little pile of manure, and questions. And no one laughed at any of my funny figures. Like, here's Johnny. Questions? JD.
So when you talk about phosphorus, precision application of phosphorus, how does the industry respond to phosphorus?
It depends, right? I'm an extension. It depends. So I gave an hour-long talk on variable rate potassium and phosphorus at InfoAg, which is the big precision ag meeting. And there was folks that just got up and walked out. It's like, hey, my company sells it, I got to sell it. It's not my choice. And then there was a line of folks afterwards that wanted to talk to me about it, and I've had 5 people email me and ask me for the literature references. So it depends. It depends on the industry. The individual consultants, independent consultants, they actually like this because they say, you know, we've been trying to go to zone management. And I can get to zone management. That's kind of an in-between between grid sampling and average for the field. You're basically doing an average for these zones. The problem is zone sampling takes a really personal touch. You've got to have a lot of really good data. You've got to continually evaluate that zone to see if it's holding up. And then maybe even you grid sample within that zone to look at some of that spatial distribution, right? But that takes a lot of involvement and hands-on, and most big commodity, big box consultants they can't do that. And so it depends on who the consultant is. And so the small guys sitting there going, I've been saying this forever, and these guys have an unfair advantage because they get to say stuff that's not true and sell things and whatever.
Well, follow up with that. Producers, people, you got producer level, when they see this kind of discussion on precision that has been involved in or adapted to precision methodology. What's their response?
Most of the time, the producers that I would talk to about this, in a sense, throw their hands up. They kind of say, or they'll say, I agree with you. And then you'll sit with them at the farm shop and you'll say, you know, okay, if you agree with me, why do you continue? It's what the consultant sells me. It's the same as the $15 an acre for the biostimulant they're putting in the seed bed. Does it work? I've never seen any evidence of it, but a fertilizer dealer sells it to me. Right. Because it sounds right. Yeah, intuitively, it sounds like it's better than what we were doing before. I was on board. I used to interpolate soil samples all the time until I read Lausen's paper, right? And so we're not doing a good job of getting that messaging out there. That's the other part. It's like we talk to industry folks a lot, and then a lot of times they end up talking to the farmers. And sometimes, and you know, when we write that up in our extension reports, we write up message amplification. But to be more precise, it's probably message obfuscation because it's being filtered through that industry guy, and they're clipping out the precision ag is good. And I said, precision ag is good, but soil interpretation doesn't work, right? And so it's this filter. And so they're selling, and grid sampling is cheap to do. You got automated soil probes, you've got software that handles it, you push the inverse distance weighting, the interpolation button in FarmWorks, and it's done and you walk away. So it's cheap to do. It's beautiful. I've had farmers tell me, I can take my soil samples, I send them off to a private lab because in 24 hours I can look at my phone and I have a map on my cell phone in 24 hours from Midwest Laboratory. And the university can't do that. And until you can do that, I have go ahead, Chad. I'm convinced. I saw Harold Van Ness give a talk once, and this is built into his adapt N nitrogen recommendation model. And it was interesting. So if you remember the nitrogen surplus that we came up with, and we did the same thing for Maryland, and it came up with saying that statewide farmers were applying about 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre more. That's about where the surplus is. And when they did their stochastic modeling of economic response to nitrogen, Harold found, and other people have found the exact same number. Now, as I go through the literature, it's always the same number, 30 pounds per acre, more than the recommendation. And economically, that's the lowest risk power position is 30 pounds more because it takes out the chance that you might be low. And I think that might, I think we need to go back and look at variability. People used to do this. People used to look at CV down the row, 25, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And now we just look at mean. We measure the length. And how accurately do we measure the length of that 40-foot plot? We run that combine down those 2 rows, and we say it's 40 foot. But if we're off by 6 inches or 12 inches on that row, or we knock down 2 plants, And so there's this noise in there, and that's the research end. But out in the field, the farmers are getting all this noise, and they need to have something more dependable. Marketplace hates uncertainty. So I think you're right. I think it, propagates beyond nutrients. I think Aaron and then John. Yes. My experience has been that the majority of growers under irrigation, well, we don't really know how leaky it is because it's so expensive to do the environmental work. But generally, some watershed studies have shown, cleaner river main branch when we have large acreages of irrigation. But actually doing lysimeter studies in all of these fields and comparing it, that work really, truly hasn't been done. But if we just use nitrogen use efficiency as a proxy, irrigated corn in Nebraska is more efficient than dryland corn in Nebraska, even in the rain-fed areas of Nebraska. Just as a broad rule of thumb. We just don't have the environmental data that's direct environmental data, so we're using these proxies just because of the cost of doing the work. John. So you have to correct for the legacy nitrate, which I think may have done, but I think when Richard shows some of those numbers tracking, he's correcting for it. But. There's a lot of them. I mean, so it's not linear, right? I mean, there's different ones, and so you run across it in different situations. So the question for the people who aren't in Princeton is that about these philosophical differences. What are they? I didn't really get explicit about it. It can be as much as that question of the farmer and the environmentalist saying, I want to set my cap here because I want to err on this side of that line versus the environmentalist, right? So that's kind of a philosophically different approach to nitrogen management. Okay. From a research perspective, I would say that learning how to communicate is what I mean by those philosophical approaches. For example, I was at an engineering meeting with a friend of mine. We're having a cup of coffee, and I said, I don't understand why more farmers don't have fertilizer on the planter. I mean, in a sense, I kind of understand, but I was kind of, just pontificating over a cup of coffee. And it's like, why don't we have more fertilizer on the planter in Kentucky? We don't see it at all. Back home, everyone puts fertilizer on the planter. Right? And it's a lot more efficient, and we see better yields and a little bit more dependability than this thing that they call side dressing, where they plant the corn and then they come in as quick as they can with a knife rig and put all their nitrogen on when it's about, yay big. And he says, it's easy. Engineer looks at it and goes, it's easy, logistics. And he runs out the math. And if he's planting at 40,000 seeds per acre and he's putting 15 gallons of product down with the planter, he needs to have 20,000 pounds per hour at the edge of the field. 20,000 pounds, that's a tractor trailer every hour delivered to the field. So engineers, the question's easy, it's logistics. I'm showing yield data trying to convince the farmer to use starter. What I need to be doing is calculating time and wages of truck drivers, right? So that's a philosophical difference, a very simple one. And go ahead. No, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, I can answer that one, then we can follow up. Okay. So the way we set up our plots, we do a complete nitrogen response trial. We don't just do farmer practice compared to green seeker. So we did this for several years, 5-6 years. I did trials on about 10 to 15 fields, whole fields, and we would have 1,000-foot plots. Each treatment replicated 5 times, 60 foot wide. And we would use the farmer's combine to measure. We're using a big enough plot to get an accurate estimate of yield in that 1,000-foot by 60-foot plot. We had 5 nitrogen rates, with one of them being the farmer's flat rate at side dressing. And then we actually had multiple green seeker treatments because we were testing nozzles too. And then we had a green seeker. So we had these huge plots. that allowed us to accurately estimate yield for that plot using a calibrated combine. So that's how we did it, and that gave us the data. Again, that's why I would say we don't have the precision to actually look at the variability in the field, because if we had the precision of yield, what we would do is each one of those yield pixels has a value, right? So let's say the combine header is 30 foot, right? So it's a 12 row combine, so it's going to be 30 foot wide. So we can set up, because we're getting a reading every, let's say 2 seconds, is about 5 feet. So every pixel in that yield data is 5 foot by 15 feet. I can actually coarsen it up, put 3 pixels together, and have a 15 foot by 15 foot, or excuse me, 30 foot by 30 foot pixel in the field, right? And then I could take all the pixels that overlay on a point where the NDVI is 3 and all the ones where the NDVI is 4 and really do some fancy stuff. That's where the lack of precision is hurting us, because we can't do that. $50 years. 50 years. 50, 50, yeah. Oh, no, absolutely not. But I mean, and so the question is okay, how does the rate compare to crop removal or crop requirement? If I can go all the way back to that slide. I might just break the machine here. So basically, it's pretty simple answer. There was no agronomic need for phosphorus in any of those plots, yet they would have been considered relatively low soil test P for the area where everyone was getting basically manure applied, right? So the Delmarva Peninsula, every acre is getting manure applied. And so this is more than the crop needs. And this, if I don't have the rates in front of me, I can go back and look it up, but the total phosphorus applied, this would be equivalent, annually to about crop removal at this rate, I think, if I remember correctly. It's about, I think it was around 2 tons per acre per year of poultry litter. I can't remember the dairy manure rates. And so that's about equivalent to crop removal, but they did it for 4 years and then stopped applying. So after this point, no more phosphorus was applied to any of these fields. And so we did see yield drift downwards in this plot, actually, but probably not due to phosphorus, probably due to some other. No-till, corn, wheat, bean rotation. Yeah, so we did 2 centimeter increments down to like, I want to say 30 centimeters or something over this time period. We've got a bunch of papers coming out on this where we did some more advanced chemical fractionations and stuff across the time period and changes. Sure. No, I would say it's probably not much better. I mean, the R squared on that was probably a little better on the green seeker. This is fake data, by the way.
Yeah,
but
I've seen data like this. I've seen data. I'm no more impressed.
Well,
I'm absolutely unimpressed.
I guess I would ask is, so this is a little different deal here, right? Is you're trying to find a critical level, right? With the green seeker, you're not. You're trying.
In the Western states, they
Sure. And so you're looking at that variability, right? But our recommendations say above 60 pounds per acre of phosphorus, right? You don't need anything. So we're picking a point. We're not picking a range. So the green seeker is different functionally and mechanistically in the way it operates because you are not picking a critical point. So you are predicting yield, right? So you've got this noise. It's accurate, but it's imprecise, okay? But so
you got one line, depending on where you are, you could have yield of 1. You could have yield of 5.
except for we're not using it across the entire field. Every second, we're adjusting the rate. And so if I show you
It still doesn't matter. At that point, you can
But with the other data, you're not doing that. We're adjusting for every plant using this. And so the sheer number, the N now has increased. You have an N of 1 if you're using the soil test approach. The green seeker approach, you've given up that accuracy in search of greater precision, intentionally. So we admit this is less accurate, and it's intentional because we're changing every second as we move across the field every 5 feet.